Welcome, survivors, to the edge of the apocalypse, where every story is a fight to stay alive. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for every like, comment, and sub. Keep hitting that bell and join the fight with me. Thanks from the bottom of my heart.
The wind up here doesn't just blow, it screams. It tears at the fabric of your gear, looking for a weak seam, a loose thread, anything to get inside and turn your blood to ice. I checked the Geiger counter clipped to my belt for the third time in 10 minutes. The clicking was erratic, a syncopated rhythm of invisible death that seemed to grow louder with every step I took toward the ridge line. My breath was freezing against the interior of my face mask, creating a claustrophobic layer of condensation that blurred my vision. But I didn't need to see perfectly to know I was close. I could smell it. Even through the filters, there was that distinct, metallic tang of ozone mixed with something sweeter, something rotting. It was the smell of a tomb that had been sealed for decades, suddenly cracked open. My name is Nate, and for the last 6 months, I'd been tracking a ghost signal across the Asian continent. A repeating loop of numbers broadcast on a frequency that shouldn't exist anymore. Everyone told me the Himalayas were clean. They said the infection never reached this altitude, that the cold froze the xenot pathogen before it could mutate. They were wrong. Dead wrong. I adjusted the strap of my rifle, the cold polymer biting into my gloved hands. The snow here wasn't white. It was gray, stained by the fallout of the tactical nukes they dropped on the lowlands years ago. I crested the ridge, my boots crunching on frozen slate, and there it was. Not a cave, not a natural formation, but a massive slab of reinforced concrete buried into the side of the mountain like a cancerous growth. A Bio-Containment Center. Abandoned. Or at least, that's what the files said. I slid down the embankment, the loose shale skittering ahead of me into the dark maw of the facility's entrance. The blast doors were massive, easily 3 feet of steel and lead, but they stood slightly ajar. Jammed open by a rusted tracked vehicle that looked like it had tried to ram its way in, or out. I didn't like the implications of that. If they tried to break out, it meant containment had failed from the inside. I reached the gap. It was just wide enough for me to squeeze through if I took off my main pack. I dropped my heavy rucksack, hiding it behind a pile of frozen debris, and kept only my tactical vest, my radio, and my weapon. Silence. That was the first thing that hit me when I stepped across the threshold. The wind outside died instantly, replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. It was warmer inside, the geothermal generators likely still running on some automated backup loop deep underground. I clicked on my shoulder-mounted light. The beam cut through the stagnant air, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended in time. The walls were lined with conduit and pipes, condensation dripping in slow, rhythmic intervals. Plink. 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 It sounded like a clock counting down. I moved forward, weapon raised, checking my corners. The floor was littered with papers, clipboards, and shredded hazmat suits. Not bodies. Just the suits. Empty. Like whatever was inside them had simply evaporated, or molted. I swept the light to the left. A security station. The glass was shattered outward. A dark stain, dry and flaking, coated the desk and the floor behind it. I ran a gloved finger over the console. Dust. Thick dust. Nobody had touched this in years. But then, why was the signal broadcasting? I pressed on, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the corridor. I was heading for the lower levels, toward the server room indicated on the faded wall schematics. The air grew heavier the deeper I went. The smell of ozone faded, replaced by that sweet, rotting scent. It was stronger now. It smelled like copper and spoiled meat. I passed a row of containment cells. The doors were glass, reinforced with mesh. In the first one, nothing. In the second, a hospital bed overturned. In the third, I stopped. My light caught something written on the inside of the glass. It was scratched into the surface, jagged and frantic. They don't die in the cold. They sleep. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. I gripped my rifle tighter, my knuckles turning white. I heard a sound. Faint. Rhythmic. Like what leather slapping against tile. Slap. Drag. Slap. Drag. It was coming from the stairwell ahead. I killed my light. Darkness swallowed me instantly, thick and total. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I waited, counting the beats of my own heart, which sounded like a drum in my ears. Then a sniff. Loud, wet, and unmistakably close. Something was in the dark with me. And it had just picked up my scent. The wind at 20,000 feet didn't just howl, it screamed, a physical force that battered against the reinforced poly mesh of my parka. I stood before the blast doors of the Sentinel-4 Bio-Containment Facility. A monolith of concrete and steel buried halfway into the glacial ice of the Himalayas. The map I'd pulled off a dead lieutenant in Kathmandu promised this place was off the grid, self-sustaining, and most importantly, sealed before the fall. My fingers were numb inside thermal gloves as I punched the manual override code into the keypad. The hydraulic hiss that followed was the sweetest sound I'd heard in 3 years of hell. As the heavy steel groaned upward, breaking a seal of ice inches thick, the screaming wind died instantly, replaced by the hum of emergency power and the smell of recycled, sterile air. I was in. I didn't rush. Rushing gets you killed. I swept the airlock with the beam of my tactical light, the rifle stock pressed tight against my shoulder. The decontamination chamber was pristine. No blood smears, no shell casings, no signs of the frantic last stands that characterized the ruins of the cities below. This was bad. Chaos means people fought. Order usually means everyone died before they knew what was happening. I moved through the decontamination mist, long since dry, and into the main atrium. The architecture was utilitarian, brutalist, and cold. I wasn't here for the architecture though. I was here for the loot. My pack felt light, too light. I needed calories, antibiotics, and ammo. The layout was standard for a Tier 1 lab. Security and reception up front, containment deep below. I vaulted the reception desk, my boots squeaking on the polished linoleum. Behind the counter, I found the first cache, a security lockbox. A quick pry with the crowbar popped the latch. Jackpot. 2 9mm magazines, a stun baton with a dead battery, and more critically, a box of military-grade stimulants. I dry swallowed a caffeine pill immediately. The fatigue of the climb was a predator waiting to drag me down, and I couldn't afford to blink. I moved deeper, toward the medical wing. The silence was oppressive. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of a held breath. I found the infirmary doors unlocked. Inside, the scavenging began in earnest. I bypassed the standard gauze and saline, bulky, low value. I went for the locked glass cabinets. Smashing the glass would be too loud, so I picked the lock, the tumblers clicking loudly in the quiet room. Inside were the treasures of the old world, broad-spectrum antibiotics, epinephrine auto-injectors, and sealed blister packs of synthetic opiates. I swept them into my pack, wrapping the glass vials in scavenged scrub tops to prevent rattling. Then I saw the nutritional supplements. High-density caloric paste, designed for coma patients. It tasted like chalk and engine oil, but one tube had enough energy to keep me moving for 2 days. I squeezed one into my mouth as I moved to the terminals. The screen flickered to life when I touched the spacebar. The timestamp on the last log was 6 months after the initial outbreak. That was impossible. The world went dark in 3. I accessed the research notes, and the blood drained from my face. They hadn't just been studying the wildfire virus here, they had been watching it change. The log entry, written by a Dr. Eris Thorne, was frantic. Subject 804 is no longer responding to thermal stimuli. The infection has adapted to the ambient temperature of the containment breach in Sector 3. Cellular structure is crystallizing. It's not freezing, it's armoring itself. I scrolled down. Images attached to the file showed a standard infected, but the skin was gray, translucent, and covered in jagged, crystalline protrusions. The virus was rewriting the host's biology to survive the extreme cold of the Himalayas. It wasn't just reanimating dead tissue anymore. It was evolving into a distinct species. The entry ended with a warning. They have stopped wandering. They are hunting in packs. They are using the ventilation system. A metallic clatter echoed from the hallway. I froze, the light of the monitor reflecting in my wide eyes. It came from above. The vents. I killed the monitor and crouched in the darkness, the red glow of the emergency exit sign the only illumination. The sound came again, a wet, scraping noise like raw meat being dragged over galvanized steel. It was moving fast. I raised my rifle, aiming at the ventilation grate in the ceiling of the infirmary. The screws holding the grate burst outward with the force of a rifle shot. It dropped to the floor in a crouch. It was humanoid, but wrong. The proportions were stretched, the limbs elongated. Its skin was a pale, icy blue, pulled taut over bones that had thickened and spiked outward. The armor the log mentioned was real. Patches of frost-like biological crystal covered its chest and forearms. It didn't groan. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a valve. It turned its head, and I saw that its eyes were gone, covered by a ridge of bone. It was blind, hunting by sound and heat. The evolution made sense. Eyes freeze at this altitude, but thermal sensitivity thrives. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The creature clicked its teeth, sharpened, needle-like incisors. It took a step, its clawed feet tapping on the tile. Then another. It was sweeping the room. I slowly reached for a glass beaker on the counter beside me. I needed a distraction. I tossed the beaker into the far corner of the room. It shattered. The reaction was instantaneous. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, oscillating frequency that made my teeth ache, and launched itself across the room with terrifying speed. It hit the wall where the sound originated, claws tearing through the drywall like wet paper. I didn't wait to see it turn around. I sprinted for the door. My movement triggered it. The displacement of air, the heat of my body, it spun around, abandoning the wall. I cleared the doorway just as it lunged, its claws sparking against the metal doorframe. I slammed the door and spun the wheel lock. A heavy thud shook the metal, followed by the screech of bone carving into steel. It was trying to cut through. I backed away, rifle raised, but I didn't fire. The noise would draw more. If the logs were right, this wasn't a lone wolf. It was a scout. I ran toward the lower levels, toward the heavy containment meant for bioweapons. The layout blueprints I'd memorized indicated a secure armory near the incinerator room on sub-level 2. I needed firepower that could crack that crystal armor. As I descended the stairwell, the temperature dropped further. The walls here were coated in a thick layer of rime ice. And then I saw them. Embedded in the ice along the walls were bodies. Researchers. Guards. But they weren't just frozen, they were cocooned. The translucent resin-like substance held them in place, and inside, I could see their bodies changing. Elongated fingers. Thickening bone density. This wasn't a research facility anymore. It was a hive. I reached the landing of sub-level 2. The air here smelled of ozone and rotten meat. The door to the armory was ahead, its heavy mag lock blinking red. Locked. I knelt, pulling the electronic bypass kit from my pack. My hands shook as I stripped the wires. Above me, on the stairs, I heard the clicking. Dozens of them. The scout had called the pack. I connected the leads, the device cycling through codes. "Come on," I whispered, the vapor of my breath clouding my vision. The clicking grew into a cacophony of hisses and screeches. They were flowing down the stairs like a landslide of ice and teeth. The light on the lock turned green. I kicked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as the first body slammed against it. The impact was heavy enough to knock dust from the ceiling. I scrambled to the weapon racks. Most were empty, looted by the staff in their final moments. But in the back, in a cage marked experimental ordnance, I found it. A prototype directed energy tool, essentially a weaponized microwave emitter designed for sterilization. And next to it, a canister of incendiary gel. The door behind me began to buckle. The metal groaned, a high-pitched whine of stressing steel. A claw punched through, the tip glowing with kinetic heat. Then another. They were peeling the door open like a tin can. I grabbed the incendiary canister and rigged it to the door handle with a strip of duct tape, pulling the pin. Then I grabbed the emitter and retreated to the rear of the armory, behind a heavy overturned table. The door gave way with a deafening crash. A tide of pale, armored nightmares poured into the room, their movements twitchy and synchronized. They scrambled over each other, a wave of teeth and claws. The lead creature, larger than the rest with a crown of bone spikes, saw me. It shrieked, preparing to lunge. I didn't hesitate. I fired a single round from my rifle into the canister on the door. The explosion was contained, a dull whump that sucked the oxygen out of the room for a split second before the gel ignited. White-hot fire engulfed the entryway, coating the first dozen infected. They didn't burn like normal flesh. The crystal armor cracked and popped, shrapnel flying across the room. They screamed, a human sound now, stripped of the monstrous overlay by the pain. But the ones behind them didn't stop. They trampled their burning kin, their bodies adapting, secreting a thick, viscous slime that hissed as it met the flames. They were fireproofing themselves in real time. I leveled the microwave emitter. "Let's see you adapt to this," I gritted out. I pulled the trigger. The air in front of me rippled. The lead creature, mid-leap, convulsed violently as the water molecules inside its cells boiled instantly. It exploded from the inside out, a spray of gore and bone shards. I swept the beam across the choke point. It was a slaughter, but my battery indicator was dropping fast. This wasn't a victory, it was a buying of time. I spotted a maintenance hatch in the floor behind the table. I kicked it open, the dark tunnel below offering the only way out. As the emitter sputtered and died, I dropped into the darkness, the screams of the evolving horde echoing above me. driven by a hunger that was becoming terrifyingly intelligent. The wind outside was a physical weight, a chaotic force battering the reinforced concrete of the mountain face, but inside the airlock, the silence was heavier. I watched the frost retreat from the interior glass of my gas mask as the pressurization cycle hissed, a sound like a dying lung. The indicator light flickered from angry red to a sickly amber. A miracle that the geothermal generators deep in the mountain's crust were still turning after 3 years of neglect. With a heavy, hydraulic clank, the inner blast door cycled open, revealing the throat of the facility. The air that rushed out didn't smell like a hospital. It smelled of ozone, stagnant copper, and the unmistakable sweet rot of death that had been preserved in a refrigerator. This was Site 14. The rumor whispered over shortwave radios was that they had been working on a cure when the world fell. The reality, staring at me from the gloom of the receiving bay, was likely far worse. I clicked on my shoulder-mounted flashlight, the LED beam cutting a sharp cone through the dust motes. The floor was a checkerboard of industrial linoleum and frozen blood. Scavenging protocol took over. My mind compartmentalized the horror into resources and threats. I moved to the security kiosk first. The guard inside was a desiccated husk, mummified by the dry, recycled air. I didn't look at his face. That's how you start seeing ghosts. I checked his belt. A standard issue P90 submachine gun hung loosely from a tactical sling. I grabbed it. The polymer frame was cold enough to burn my gloved hands. I racked the slide hard to break the ice seal. It cycled with a crisp metallic snap. A half-full magazine. Better than nothing. On the desk, a manifesto of incoming shipments lay under a layer of dust. Biological sample 89 Delta. Incineration fuel. Cryostasis units. And a frantic scrawl in red marker across the bottom. Asterisk, the cold does not kill it. Asterisk. Moving deeper, the architecture shifted from utilitarian gray to clinical white. The temperature dropped further. My breath plumed violently before me, fogging the edges of my vision. I needed caloric density if I was going to survive the trek back down the mountain, and I needed gear that wouldn't shatter at 20 below zero. I found a break room on the second sub-level. It had been barricaded from the outside, steel lockers welded to the frame. That was the first bad sign. You barricade from the inside to keep things out. You barricade from the outside to keep things in. I used my crowbar, the screech of metal on metal echoing dangerously loud in the oppressive quiet. Inside, the scene was a tableau of despair, but a goldmine for a scavenger. Vending machines smashed open. I ignored the scattered chips, dust by now, and went for the protein bars behind the counter. Vacuum sealed. I shoved handfuls into my pack, checking the seals for punctures. Then, the prize, a medical wall locker. Morphine, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and epinephrine. I swept it all into my pouch. As I secured the loot, I noticed the bodies in the corner. They weren't just dead, they were wrong. I approached the pile of corpses cautiously. They were huddled together, likely for warmth in their final moments. But their skin wasn't the gray-green of the low-altitude infected I was used to. It was translucent, shimmering with a bluish hue. I leaned in closer, adjusting the beam of my light. The veins were black and distended, forming geometric patterns under the skin, sharp angles rather than organic curves. I touched one with the tip of my barrel. The flesh didn't depress, it was hard as stone. Not frozen, calcified. The virus here hadn't just reanimated them, it had rebuilt them. A logbook lay open on the table, the pen frozen to the page. I pried it loose and read the final entry. The erratic mutation rate of the pathogen in 0-degree environments is catastrophic. We thought the cold would slow it down. We were wrong. The virus is adapting. It's synthesizing a biological cryoprotectant, turning their blood into a slush that doesn't freeze. It hardens the dermis to retain heat. They are becoming armored. They don't decay here. They just wait. A chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature spiked down my spine. Asterisk, they just wait. Asterisk, I looked back at the pile. Did a head move? My light played tricks on me in the shadows. I stepped back, raising the rifle. The corpse at the bottom of the pile, a man in a shredded lab coat, twitched. It wasn't the sluggish, groggy movement of a sleeper waking up. It was a sharp, mechanical jerk. Then the sound. Not a groan. A clicking sound, like ice cracking on a lake. The pile shifted. The translucent skin of the lab coat creature pulsed. I saw the eyes open. They were entirely white, no iris, no pupil, just a film of nictitating membrane adapted to snow blindness. It looked at me, and I realized it wasn't seeing me. It was sensing the heat of my body against the frigid background. I didn't wait for it to stand. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the creature in the chest, but instead of tearing through rotten meat, it sparked. It ricocheted off the calcified ribcage, burying itself in the wall. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched frequency that vibrated in my teeth. The pile exploded into motion. I scrambled backward, kicking the door slammed shut, jamming the crowbar through the handles just as the first body slammed against it. The metal buckled. These things were strong. The virus had rewired their muscle fibers, sacrificing fine motor control for raw, hydraulic power. The door hinges groaned. I turned and ran. The facility was a maze. I needed to find the armory or a secure lab, somewhere with heavier doors. I sprinted past the decontamination showers, my boots slipping on the frost. Behind me, the break room door gave way with a crash that sounded like a structural collapse. The clicking sound multiplied. There were dozens of them. I banked left into a corridor marked Viral Containment Level 4. The heavy blast doors here were open, stuck halfway. I squeezed through the gap, my vest scraping against the gear teeth. Inside, the room was dominated by rows of shattered glass cylinders. This was where they kept the experiments. And the experiments were loose. I scanned the room frantically. A terminal on the far wall was glowing with emergency power. I rushed to it. System override, I muttered, fingers clumsy. Close blast doors. Access denied? Of course. I looked around. On a nearby table, next to a centrifuge, lay a prototype weapon, some kind of pneumatic rivet gun modified for bone saws, and beside it, a canister of liquid nitrogen. Scavenger instinct flared, asterisk improvise. Asterisk the clicking was at the blast door gap. A hand reached through, fingers elongated, tipped with jagged bone spurs where the fingernails used to be. The evolution wasn't just defensive, it was predatory. The virus was turning them into weapons. I grabbed the nitrogen canister and a heavy pipe wrench lying next to the centrifuge. The creature squeezed its head through. The face was a nightmare of blue veins and white eyes. I didn't shoot. Bullets were useless against that chest. I waited. As it pushed its shoulders through, getting stuck for a fraction of a second, I hurled the canister. It struck the floor right beneath the creature's face, the valve shearing off. A cloud of white vapor exploded upward, enveloping the creature's head. The supercooled gas hit the antifreeze blood. Science versus mutation. The creature screamed, but the sound was cut short as the liquid nitrogen flash froze the moisture in its throat. The biological cryoprotectant had limits. I swung the wrench with everything I had. It connected with the frozen head. It didn't splash, it shattered. Fragments of skull and brain clattered across the floor like dropped porcelain. The body went limp, blocking the gap. The others behind it clawed at the corpse, trying to pull it through, but the deadlock bought me time. I backed away, chest heaving, scanning the lab. In the back, a heavy vault door labeled cold storage. I spun the wheel. It was unlocked. I threw myself inside and spun the locking mechanism shut. The heavy steel thudded into place, muffling the shrieks outside. I was safe, for the moment. I slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor, my heart hammering against my ribs. I checked my loot. The meds were intact. The food was secure. I looked around the vault. It wasn't empty. Shelves lined the walls, stacked not with bodies, but with seeds and data drives. But on the center table sat a single, ruggedized briefcase. I pulled it toward me and popped the latches. Inside, resting in foam, were 3 vials of a golden liquid. The label was handwritten. Strain Delta Reverse. Unstable. Metabolic Accelerator. It wasn't a cure. It was a weapon. A way to burn the virus out by overheating the host until they cooked from the inside. I looked at the vials, then at the freezing door where the monsters were scratching. The infection had evolved to conquer the cold. This serum was designed to ignite the fire. I loaded a syringe. If I was going to die in this frozen tomb, I'd take as many of those ice demons with me as I could. The rusted wheel of the airlock shrieked. A sound like a dying animal echoing through the valley before being swallowed by the relentless Himalayan wind. My gloves, thick with insulation but worn at the palms, slipped twice before the seal finally broke. A hiss of equalizing pressure hit me, smelling not of the crisp mountain air, but of stale recycled oxygen, copper, and something sweeter, rotting biological matter preserved in the cold. I pushed the heavy steel door inward, the hydraulics groaning in protest, and stepped into the darkness of Site Omicron 9. The flashlight mounted on my shoulder flickered, casting a strobe light panic across the entryway before stabilizing. This place wasn't on any map. It was a ghost story whispered in the refugee camps of Kathmandu. A place where the World Health Organization supposedly tried to play God before the world ended. Now, it was just a tomb, and I was the grave robber. The reception area was a chaotic freeze frame of the final evacuation. Papers were strewn across the floor, frozen into a papier-mâché pulp by the moisture that had seeped in over the years. I stepped over a body huddled in the corner, a security guard, his tactical vest still strapped tight. I knelt, ignoring the cramping in my frozen quadriceps, and began the ritual of the scavenge. I patted down the corpse with practiced efficiency. No weapons. Someone had already taken his sidearm, but his belt pouches were a goldmine. 2 sealed magazines of 9mm ammunition, a tactical knife with a serrated edge, and miraculously, a vacuum-sealed ration bar. I tucked the ammo into my chest rig and ripped open the ration. It tasted like sawdust and chemicals, but the calories hit my system like a jolt of electricity. Scavenging isn't just about hoarding, it's about caloric math. Every step I took in this frozen hell burned energy I barely had. Finding food this early was a good omen, or a trap. I checked the guard's neck. The skin was black, necrotic, but weirdly crystallized. The veins weren't blue, they were a shimmering, iridescent violet. I pulled my hand back. This was the first sign that the infection up here wasn't the standard strain we fought in the cities. The altitude, the cold, or the science done here had changed it. I moved deeper, bypassing the elevators, death traps and the power outage, and forcing the emergency stairwell door open. The air grew colder as I descended into the bowels of the mountain. Level 3 Bioresearch. The hallway was lined with shattered glass. I kept my weapon, a battered carbine scavenged from a dead UN peacekeeper, raised. The silence was heavy, oppressive. It wasn't the empty silence of a void. It was the holding breath silence of a hunter. I swept the beam into the first lab. Benches were overturned, centrifuges smashed. I rifled through the drawers. Most were empty or filled with useless paperwork, but the third drawer yielded a prize. A box of sterile syringes and 3 vials of broad-spectrum antibiotics. In the apocalypse, a cut finger kills you faster than a zombie if it goes septic. I bagged them, wrapping the glass vials in a stray lab coat to prevent clinking. On the central desk, a terminal blinked with a low-power reserve mode. I wiped the frost from the screen. A digital log was still accessible. I tapped last entry. The timestamp was 3 years ago. The text was erratic, typed in haste. Subject 19 is not responding to cryostasis as predicted. The pathogen adapts to the thermal drop. Instead of dormancy, we are seeing metabolic inversion. The host body generates internal heat by consuming its own muscle mass at an accelerated rate, then enters a hibernation state until prey is detected. It's not just a virus anymore, it's a parasite that turns the host into a thermal trap. Do not open the log ended there. Metabolic inversion. The phrase chilled me more than the ambient temperature. The infected down here weren't just shambling corpses. They were biological furnaces waiting for a spark. I heard it then. A wet, clicking sound from the ventilation duct above. I froze, killing my light. In the pitch black, I listened. The clicking stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic thrumming, like a rapid heartbeat. I backed away slowly, my boots crunching softly on the frost-covered tile. I needed to get to the secure storage at the back of the lab. That's where the high-grade antivirals or experimental suppressors would be. I turned my light back on, risking exposure for speed, and sprinted toward the vault door. The beam caught movement in the periphery. Something pale. Something fast. I reached the vault. Locked. Maglock system. I didn't have the codes, but I had a crowbar in desperation. I jammed the iron into the seam and hauled back with everything I had. Metal screeched. Behind me, a crash. I spun around, weapon raised. Standing on top of a lab table was one of them. It didn't look like the gray, rotting things from the lowlands. This thing was stark white, its skin translucent enough that I could see the dark, pulsing organs beneath. It lacked eyes. The sockets had sealed over with thick, callus-like tissue, but its nostrils flared wide, tasting the heat of my body. It was gaunt, skeletal, stripped of all unnecessary fat, pure sinew and bone designed for terrifying bursts of speed. The evolution the log spoke of. It had adapted to the blind dark and the crushing cold. It shrieked, a sound that wasn't a vocal cord vibration but a high-pressure release of steam from its throat, and launched itself at me. I fired. The carbine barked, the muzzle flashed blinding in the dark room. The rounds hit the creature in midair, punching through the thin chest cavity. Black ichor sprayed, steaming where it hit the freezing floor. It crashed into me, knocking the wind from my lungs. The heat radiating off it was intense, like opening an oven door. It clawed at my face, its nails elongated into jagged hooks. I jammed the barrel of the rifle under its chin and pulled the trigger. A wet thud, and the thing went limp, its internal heat immediately beginning to dissipate, the body steaming as it cooled rapidly. I shoved the carcass off me, gasping for air. The blood on my jacket was already freezing into black crystals. They were fragile, glass cannons, high damage, low durability. But where there was one, there was a hive. I turned back to the vault, adrenaline giving me the strength to shatter the locking mechanism. The door swung open. Inside, rows of refrigeration units hummed on backup power. I scanned the labels. Vaccine prototype do not administer. Viral sample Delta. And then, on the bottom shelf, a heavy Pelican case labeled tactical response gear. I popped the latches. Inside wasn't medicine, but something better for right now, a thermal imaging monocle and a suppressed MP5 with subsonic rounds. The scientists had prepared for a breach. I strapped the monocle on. The room transformed into a spectrum of blues and blacks. I looked out into the hallway. My heart stopped. The corridor wasn't empty. Dozens of heat signatures were glowing in the walls, in the ceiling tiles, under the floor grates. They were everywhere, dormant, glowing like embers in the ash. The gunshot had woken them. The bright orange blobs began to shift, descending from the ceiling, crawling out of vents. They moved with a fluid, spider-like grace that the lowland zombies couldn't dream of. I had walked into a nest. The evolution was complete. They weren't mindless eaters anymore. They were ambush predators, and I was the only warm thing in a world of ice. I grabbed the SMG. Grabbed a handful of the prototype vials, gambling that they might be worth something to the warlords back south, and prepared to run. The mountain hadn't preserved the past, it had incubated the future. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door sealing behind me was the sweetest sound I'd heard in months, cutting off the shrieking gale of the Himalayas instantly. I stood in the amber glow of the emergency airlock, watching the pressure gauge stabilize, my breath pluming in the freezing air. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized, and tasted of stale recycled oxygen and ozone. I wasn't just sheltering from the blizzard anymore. I had stepped into the tomb of the old world's hubris. This was Site Omicron, a black site Bio-Containment Center buried 3,000 meters up, and if the rumors were true, it held the answers to why the dead didn't just die, they changed. My hands, wrapped in layers of duct-taped wool and scavenged Gore-Tex, trembled as I unslung my rifle. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the adrenaline crash. I needed calories, and I needed them now. The inner door cycled open with a groan of neglected machinery, revealing a cavernous reception atrium bathed in the flickering strobe of a failing backup generator. It was a massacre frozen in time. Unlike the rot-filled cities below, the cold here had preserved everything. Security guards in tactical gear lay in heaps around the metal detectors, their bodies twisted in rigor mortis. Brass casings carpeting the floor around them. I stepped over a barricade of overturned desks, my boots crunching on shattered glass. Scavenging mode kicked in, a primal flowchart of needs. Priority 1, security. Priority 2, sustainment. I knelt beside a fallen guard, his face a mask of blue, frost-bitten agony. His P90 was frozen to his gloves, but the magazines in his vest were pristine. I stripped them, the cold biting through my own gloves, and shoved the ammunition into my dump pouch. 5, 7mm rounds. Rare. Armor-piercing. A good start. I checked his pockets, bypassing the wallet and photos of a family long gone. Fishing out a half-eaten energy bar and a sealed packet of hydration salts. I ate the bar right there, the chocolate hard as stone, ignoring the metallic taste of the air. Moving deeper, the architecture shifted from administrative sterility to industrial dread. The walls became brushed steel and reinforced concrete, marked with hazard stripes and biosafety level indicators. BSL-4. The hot zone. I bypassed the elevators, death traps and a power failure, and took the service stairs. The air grew colder as I descended, which didn't make sense physically, but biologically, the facility felt wrong. The smell hit me on sub-level 3, not the sweet, cloying stench of decay I was used to in the valleys, but something chemical. Like ammonia and burning copper. I forced the door to the virology wing open with a crowbar, the metal screeching a protest that echoed down the dark corridor. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a hallway lined with observation windows. This is where the evolution became undeniable. In the cities, the Zeds were shamblers, mindless, rotting sacks of meat that fell apart after a few months of exposure. But here? I approached a shattered observation window. Inside the lab, a subject was strapped to a vertical gurney. It hadn't rotted. The skin had turned a translucent, pearlescent gray, pulled tight over bone and muscle that looked denser, more corded than a human's. I shined my light closer. The veins were black, visible through the skin, forming a lattice-like web around the chest and throat. This wasn't just necrosis, it was fortification. The virus, isolated in this high-altitude freezer, hadn't just reanimated the host, it had adapted to the extreme cold. It had synthesized a natural antifreeze in the blood, thickening it, turning the host into a hyper-efficient predator designed for low-temperature environments. I saw the logs on a nearby terminal, the screen cracked but the jagged text still legible on a printed clipboard nearby. Subject 82 exhibits 300% increase in tensile muscle strength. Metabolic functions slowed to near stasis. Subject reacts to thermal signatures. It is hunting heat. I killed my flashlight instantly. Darkness swallowed the corridor, save for the rhythmic red pulse of the emergency strobes. Hunting heat. I was a walking furnace in a freezer. I crouched low, controlling my breathing, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed to keep moving, to find the containment storage where the high-grade antivirals or experimental suppressants might be stored. I navigated by the red pulses, stepping carefully to avoid the debris. I found a break room, the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the scavenging gods smiled, a vending machine, glass intact. I shattered it with the butt of my rifle, the noise deafening in the silence, and frantically shoveled freeze-dried meals and water bottles into my pack. As I grabbed a first aid kit from the wall, I saw it. In the corner of the room, huddled under a table, was a corpse. But it wasn't a victim. It was one of them. It was curled into a ball dormant. Its skin was icy white, covered in a thin layer of frost. I froze, my hand hovering over a bandage roll. The creature's chest didn't rise and fall, but as the heat from my body radiated outward in the small room, the creature's head snapped up. There were no eyes, just milky white orbs devoid of pupils, evolved to sense thermal gradients rather than light. It let out a sound that wasn't a groan, but a high-pitched chitter, like a bat or an insect. It unfolded with terrifying speed, its joints cracking audibly. The evolution was horrific up close. Its fingers had elongated into bone-hard talons, likely for gripping ice and rock. I didn't hesitate. I brought the rifle up and fired. The muzzle flash was blinding in the dark. The round hit its center mass, but instead of the wet thud of tearing flesh, there was a crack, like striking a frozen side of beef. The creature didn't fall. It lunged, clearing the distance between us in a blur. I sidestepped, the wind of its passing chilling my face, and slammed the stock of my rifle into its spine. It felt like hitting a concrete pillar. It scrambled on the linoleum, claws gouging deep furrows in the floor, turning back toward my heat signature. I switched to semi-auto and aimed for the head. 1, 2, 3 shots. The skull shattered like porcelain. Black, viscous sludge, not blood, but that coagulated viral antifreeze, splattered across the room. I didn't wait to see if it twitched. I sprinted out of the break room, abandoning stealth. The gunshot had rung the dinner bell. From the depths of the hallway, from the shattered labs and the dark corners of Sublevel 3, I heard answering chitters. Dozens of them. The facility wasn't abandoned, it was a hive. I ran toward the secure storage vault at the end of the hall, my lungs burning with the icy air. I wasn't just fighting the dead anymore. I was fighting a new species, one forged in the ice and silence of the death zone. I reached the vault door, spinning the locking wheel with frantic strength. It groaned, the heavy tumblers clicking into place. I threw myself inside and slammed it shut just as a heavy body impacted the steel from the outside. Inside the vault, the air was still and freezing. I clicked my flashlight back on. Rows of shelves lined the room. Not food. Not weapons. Vials. Thousands of them, glowing faintly blue in their cryo-storage units. I walked to the nearest rack and wiped the frost from a label. Strain Epsilon Thermic Adaptation Prototype. A wave of nausea hit me. They weren't studying the evolution. They engineered it. They made them cold-resistant to create super soldiers, and the world ended before they could turn it off. I slumped against the wall, the scratching on the other side of the door growing louder, more rhythmic. I had found the jackpot of scavenging, the truth of the infection, but as the chittering multiplied outside, I realized I had scavenged my way into a tomb that was never meant to be opened. The hydraulics hissed, a dying breath from a mechanical giant that hadn't inhaled in a decade. As the blast door ground open, inch by agonizing inch, the wind from the Himalayan peaks outside stopped howling and was replaced by a silence so profound it felt like pressure against my eardrums. My Geiger counter remained mercifully silent, but I kept my respirator strapped tight. In a Bio-Containment Center, radiation was the least of my worries. The airlock cycled, the inner lights flickering with the erratic pulse of a failing backup generator. I stepped into the decontamination antechamber. The beam of my tactical light cutting through swirling dust motes that looked disturbingly like dried spores. The facility, designated Apex 4 according to the faded stencil on the wall, was a tomb of chrome and shattered glass. The cold here was different from the mountains outside. Outside, the cold was wind and ice. Inside, it was a stagnant, heavy chill that seeped through my thermal layers. I moved toward the security checkpoint, my boots crunching on frozen tiles. The guard in the booth was long dead, a desiccated husk slumped over a console. The low humidity and freezing temperatures at this altitude had mummified him perfectly. No rot, just leathered skin stretched tight over bone. I pried a level 3 keycard from his frozen grip. His fingers snapped off like dry twigs. I didn't flinch. You stop flinching after the first year. I checked his sidearm, a standard issue P226. The slide was frozen shut, useless. I left it and moved on. My priority was supplies. Filtration units, antibiotics, and high-calorie rations. The manifest in the lobby indicated a storage locker on the third sublevel, but I had to pass through the research wing first. As I descended into the belly of the facility, the evolution of the infection became horrifiedly apparent. The walls of the main corridor were smeared with a substance that wasn't quite blood. It was black, viscous, and had hardened into a resin-like shell. In the cities, the infected were shambling masses of rotting meat, falling apart as the virus consumed them. Here, the environment had forced a different path. I found the first one in the observation gallery overlooking Lab B. It was standing perfectly still, facing the corner. At first glance, I thought it was a statue or a suit of armor. Its skin had turned a deep, obsidian black, an adaptation to absorb whatever meager heat existed in this frozen hell. The flesh wasn't soft, it was calcified. The virus, unable to thrive in the rapid metabolic cycle of a warm environment, had slowed down, reinforcing the host structure instead of consuming it. I raised my rifle, aiming for the base of the skull, and took a step. The floor creaked. The thing didn't groan. It didn't make that wet, gurgling sound the city walkers made. It snapped its head around with the mechanical precision of a servo motor. Its eyes were gone, covered by a thick, translucent film of cataracts or ice. It screeched, a high-frequency sound like metal grinding on metal, and launched itself at me. The speed was terrifying. Without the limitations of pain or muscle fatigue, it closed the 20 feet between us in a heartbeat. I fired twice. The 5.56 rounds sparked off its chest, chipping the calcified skin but failing to penetrate the ribcage. It slammed into me, knocking the wind from my lungs. It felt like fighting a bag of rocks. Its fingers were fused into jagged claws of bone and black resin. I brought the stock of my rifle up, smashing it into the creature's face, hearing the crunch of hardened cartilage. It didn't stumble. It just reoriented, jaws snapping inches from my throat. I drew my combat knife, jamming it into the soft tissue under the jaw, twisting upward. Black ichor sprayed across my visor, freezing instantly. The creature convulsed, its nervous system finally severed, and it dropped like a marionette with cut strings. I shoved the body off, gasping for air through my filters. These weren't zombies. They were biological weapons forged by the cold. They were armored, fast, and silent. I checked my ammo. 2 rounds spent. Too many. I had to be smarter. I moved deeper, stepping over the shattered remains of lab equipment. I found a terminal in the virology department that still had power. The logs were a nightmare of scientific detachment. Subject 44 displays complete cessation of unnecessary organ function. Epidermis hardening. Blood viscosity increasing to act as natural antifreeze. The pathogen is adapting to the climate controls. They knew. They watched it happen and did nothing until it was too late. I reached the storage sector, forcing the mag lock with a portable battery pack I'd scavenged from a rover outside. The shelves were half empty, looted by panic staff before the lockdown, but the back rows were untouched. I found gold, 3 boxes of pristine broad-spectrum antibiotics, a crate of freeze-dried military rations, and most importantly, a case of experimental viral suppressants. The label read V suppress 09, delays onset of neural degradation. It wasn't a cure, but it was time. In this world, time was the only currency that mattered. As I loaded the loot into my pack, the weight comforting against my spine, the facility groaned. A rhythmic thumping echoed through the ventilation shafts. It wasn't the machinery. It was footsteps. Heavy, synchronized footsteps. A horde. But not a mindless swarm. These things were hunting. I realized then that the screech of the one I killed wasn't just a reaction, it was a signal. I had rung the dinner bell in a hive of dormant monsters. I sprinted back toward the stairwell, abandoning stealth. The shadows in the hallway seemed to peel away from the walls. Dozens of the obsidian figures emerged from the gloom, their movements jerky but blindingly fast. I switched my rifle to semi-auto, picking shots carefully. I aimed for the joints, knees and hips, shattering the calcified bone to immobilize them. Headshots were too risky with their armored skulls. One by one, they collapsed, clawing at the floor tiles, screeching that terrible metal-on-metal cry. I hit the blast door of the stairwell, slamming the manual override. The heavy steel slid shut just as a fist hammered against it, denting the metal. I jammed a crowbar through the wheel handle to hold it. I could hear them on the other side, scratching, testing the barrier. They weren't just banging on it, they were looking for the weakness. The infection here had evolved a rudimentary hive intelligence. Or perhaps the cold just preserved enough of the human brain to make them dangerous problem solvers. I climbed, my lungs burning, the weight of the scavenged gear pulling me down. I made it to the airlock, the red emergency lights bathing the room in blood-colored hues. I cycled the door, watching the pressure gauge rise. As the outer door opened to the blinding white of the Himalayan storm, I looked back into the dark corridor of the facility. The scratches on the inner door had stopped. They were waiting. They knew I had to sleep eventually. I stepped out into the snow, the wind tearing at my suit. I had the medicine. I had the food. But as I looked at the blackened fluid freezing on my knife, I knew the intel I carried was far more dangerous. The virus hadn't just survived the end of the world, it was optimizing itself. And if these things ever came down from the mountains, the survivors in the valleys didn't stand a chance. The hydraulic seal screamed, a piercing shriek of metal on metal that shattered the silence of the Himalayas. For a moment, the sound was more terrifying than the biting wind that had been gnawing at my frostbitten cheeks for the last 48 hours. Sound traveled far in the thin air, and up here, sound usually meant death. But as the blast door groaned inward, pushing aside a drift of snow that had accumulated over a decade of neglect, the promise of shelter outweighed the fear of detection. I stumbled into the airlock, the heavy rubber of my boots sliding on the grated floor, and slammed the manual override. The outer door ground shut, severing the connection to the howling white void outside. Silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the natural, indifferent silence of the mountain, it was the pressurized, heavy silence of a tomb. My breath plumed before me in the emergency red lighting as I checked my Geiger counter. Green. No radiation. That was the first miracle. I stripped off my outer parka, the Gore-Tex shredded and stained with the dark, frozen ichor of the climbers I'd had to put down at Base Camp 2. They were slow, frozen solid, but they were relentless. This facility, however, Site 9, was supposed to be a myth. A black site bio-containment wing buried in the rock face, powered by geothermal vents deep in the crust. I pulled the charging handle of my rifle, checking the chamber. 1 round. My last magazine had 7 left. Scavenging wasn't just a priority, it was an ultimatum. Moving past the decontamination showers, the facility opened up into a brutalist cathedral of concrete and reinforced glass. The air was stale, smelling of ozone and distinct copper tang of old blood, but it was warmer than outside. The geothermal generators were still humming deep below, keeping the core temperature just above freezing. I swept the beam of my tactical light across the lobby. Skeletal remains clad in lab coats littered the floor, but they weren't piled defensively. They were scattered face down, as if they had simply dropped mid-stride. I approached the nearest corpse, turning it over with the toe of my boot. The skin was desiccated, pulled tight over the bone-like parchment, but there were no bite marks. No trauma. I knelt, examining the ID badge, *DR. Eris Thorne, virologist, level 5 clearance. * next to his hand lay a shatterproof tablet. I pocketed it. Information was weightless, but it was the most valuable resource left. The search for supplies led me deeper, past the administrative wing and into the logistics sector. The cafeteria was a goldmine. The dry storage pantry had been breached, likely by rats, but the rats were long dead. I found cases of military-grade MREs, freeze-dried vacuum packs meant to last 50 years. I tore one open, beef stew, and ate the dry, crumbling block without waiting to hydrate it. The calories hit my system like a drug. I swept the shelves, stuffing my pack until the zippers strained. Water purification tablets, electrolyte blends, caffeine gum. I found a janitorial closet stocked with industrial batteries and, miraculously, a flare gun with a box of shells. But it was the infirmary that changed everything. The glass cabinets were locked, but the skeletons on the floor had keys. I loaded up on broad-spectrum antibiotics, morphine injectors, and sterile bandages. It was while I was raiding a drawer labeled experimental stimulants that I saw the containment logs on the wall. The whiteboard was still covered in frantic scribbles, the marker ink preserved by the cold, dry air. A timeline drawn in red detailed the infection's progression. Day 1, subject 0 exposure. Day 4, hemorrhagic fever. Day 7, reanimation. But then, the timeline branched. Day 14, adaptation. I stopped, the morphine vial in my hand trembling slightly. I walked over to the adjacent terminal, plugging in the tablet I'd scavenged earlier to bypass the biometric lock. The screen flickered to life, accessing the local server. I pulled up the video logs from the date of the lockdown. The face of Dr. Thorne appeared, pale and sweating, backlit by the flickering strobes of an emergency alarm. "It's not just reanimation." Thorne's voice crackled, tinny and distorted. "The selenium strain didn't like the cold. We thought the mountains would be a natural barrier. We were wrong. It adapted. It's using the host's own cryoprotectants. It's evolving the physiology to survive the freeze. I killed the feed and moved toward the secure labs. I needed to see it." Scavenging weapons was next on the list, but understanding the enemy was survival. The blast doors to Sector C, bioweapons, were jammed half open. I squeezed through. The temperature dropped here. Liquid nitrogen tanks lined the walls, some ruptured, creating a localized fog that clung to the floor. And there, in the center of the room, were the tubes. Cylinder after cylinder of reinforced plexiglass, suspended in the center of the room. Most were empty, shattered from the inside. One was intact. I wiped the frost from the glass. The thing inside was human, once. But the virus had rewritten its genetic code. Its skin was translucent blue, a network of black veins visible underneath, pumping a sludge that I realized was a natural antifreeze. Its chest cavity was expanded, ribs cracked outward to accommodate massive, hypertrophied lungs designed to extract oxygen from thin air. The fingers had elongated into bone-hard talons. This wasn't a zombie. It was an apex predator designed for the tundra. A noise behind me. A wet clicking sound. Not a footstep. It sounded like ice cracking. I spun around, raising the rifle. The fog on the floor swirled. From the shadows of the ventilation shaft, a shape uncoiled. It was one of the escapees. It wore the shredded remnants of a hazmat suit, fused to its flesh. It didn't shamble. It moved with a twitchy, insectal grace, clinging to the pipes on the ceiling. Its eyes were milky white, covered by a secondary translucent lid. It hissed, a sound that vibrated in my chest. This was the evolution Thorne warned about. The standard shamblers were dead meat, these things were hunters. It launched itself. I didn't aim, I just fired. The shot deafened me in the enclosed space. The bullet caught it in the shoulder, spinning it mid-air, but there was no spray of blood. Just a thick, black tar that oozed slowly. It hit the ground and scrambled upright instantly, ignoring the impact. I backed up, firing again, aiming for the head. The round sparked off the metal plating of its hazmat collar. It lunged. I swung the rifle stock, catching it in the jaw, feeling the bone shatter, but it slammed me into the control console. The strength was hydraulic. It pinned me, its jaws opening to reveal rows of needle teeth designed to tear through thermal gear. I fumbled for the flare gun on my belt. The creature's breath smelled of ammonia and rot. As it snapped at my throat, I jammed the barrel of the flare gun into the exposed ribcage where the suit was torn and pulled the trigger. The magnesium flare ignited inside the chest cavity. The creature didn't scream. It made a sound like a steam whistle. It convulsed, the intense heat boiling the antifreeze in its veins instantly. It thrashed backward, clawing at its own chest as smoke poured from its mouth and eyes. I scrambled back, racking the slide of my rifle, but it was done. It collapsed, burning from the inside out, the smell of cooked meat and chemical fire filling the room. I stood there, panting, watching the magnesium burn white-hot. I wasn't safe here. The facility wasn't a shelter, it was a hive. I quickly moved to the security station, barricading the door with a heavy steel desk. I needed to access the armory logs. If these things were evolving, my 5.56mm rounds were going to be insufficient. I accessed the inventory list, * experimental rail prototypes. Incendiary compounds. Cryostasis grenades. * the loot in this place could turn the tide of the war, or at least keep me alive long enough to get down the mountain. But as I scrolled through the research notes, a final file caught my eye, * airborne transmission vectors in low oxygen environments. I froze. I touched my face, feeling the cold skin. The headache I'd attributed to the altitude throbbed behind my eyes. I looked at the dead creature, then at the ventilation grate. The evolution wasn't just physical. The virus had learned to fly. I grabbed a sealed rebreather mask from the emergency locker and strapped it on, the rubber digging into my skin. I had food. I had weapons. But as I looked at the sprawling map of the facility, realizing I was 3 miles deep into the mountain with a legion of those things between me and the exit, I realized the scavenging was just beginning. I wasn't just looting for survival anymore. I was harvesting the means to kill a new species. The wind outside was a physical weight, a screeching banshee tearing at the thermal layering of my parka. But the silence inside the airlock was heavier. I had spent 3 days climbing the sheer face of the Nanda Devi Ridge to reach the coordinates broadcast on the emergency loop, expecting a bunker or a military outpost. Instead, I found this, the Acer Bio-Containment Facility, a monolith of concrete and reinforced steel buried halfway into the glacial ice. The airlock cycled with a groan of tortured hydraulics, the orange emergency strobes casting long, rhythmic shadows that danced over the frost-rimed floor. My Geiger counter clicked once, then fell silent. No radiation, just the cold. The interior temperature was stable at barely above freezing, meaning the primary reactor was likely in low-power mode, keeping the cryosystems active while the life support failed. I pulled my rebreather mask tighter. The air smelled of stale ozone and something copper-sharp, blood that had dried decades ago. I moved into the intake atrium, my boots crunching on shattered glass. The scavenging potential here was astronomical, but so was the risk. The lobby was a graveyard of frozen statues. Site security personnel, scientists, maintenance crew, they were scattered across the floor, preserved by the sub-zero temperatures. Unlike the Shamblas in the valleys below, who rotted into sludge in the humidity, these corpses were pristine. Too pristine. I knelt beside a security officer, his face twisted in a rictus of agony, hands clawing at his throat. I wasn't looking for a pulse. I was looking for his belt. I unclipped a jagged tactical knife, a pristine Glock 17 with 2 spare magazines, and a heavy ring of magnetic keycards. His pockets yielded 3 sealed energy bars, military grade, high calorie, and a foil packet of water purification tablets. Gold dust. I shoved them into my pack, my fingers stiff in my gloves. That's when I noticed the veins in his neck. They weren't blue or black. They were white. A crystalline lattice structure had erupted beneath the skin, tracing the jugular like frost on a windowpane. This wasn't the Z1 virus I knew. This was something that had adapted to the cold. Accessing the deeper sectors required the keycards. I bypassed the elevators, death traps in a power outage, and took the service stairs down to level 3, virology and containment. The stairwell was a descent into hell. Scratches gouged the concrete walls, deep furrows that had shredded the rebar. Whatever had done this had claws harder than steel. I kept my carbine raised, the tactical light cutting a cone through the dark. The scavenging improved the deeper I went. In a busted storage locker, I found a cache of Tyvek hazmat suits, duct tape, and miraculously, a box of epinephrine injectors. I took it all. Scavenging isn't just about food, it's about keeping the machine of the body running when everything else stops. But the prize was the research lab. The heavy blast doors were jammed open by a forklift, the operator long dead inside the cage. I slipped through the gap. The lab was a sprawling chaotic mess of overturned centrifuges and shattered sample vials. But the terminal on the main desk was flickering. I wiped the frost from the screen and tapped the spacebar. The system prompted for clearance. I swiped the dead guard's card. Access granted? I needed to know what I was walking into. I pulled up the last entry, dated 4 years ago. Subject 82 has breached containment. The cryostasis didn't kill the pathogen, it forced a mutation. The virus is no longer utilizing the host's metabolic heat. It is converting the host's biological fluids into a hypercooled antifreeze solution. It thrives in the ice. It hunts heat. God help us, it can see thermal signatures through walls. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone in a tomb. I was a glowing beacon of heat in a freezer. I heard the sound then, a clicking, like ice cracking on a frozen lake, coming from the ventilation grid above me. I killed my flashlight instantly, plunging the lab into the red gloom of the emergency LEDs. I crouched behind a heavy slate workbench, breathing through my nose, slowing my heart rate. The clicking grew louder. A vent grate 10 meters away exploded outward. Something dropped to the floor with a wet slap. It wasn't a human silhouette. It was elongated, skeletal. The creature rose on all fours. It had been a man once, but the infection had ravaged the bone structure. The skin was translucent and blue, stretched tight over joints that had sprouted jagged, icicle-like spurs. It didn't have eyes, just a smooth, pale ridge of cartilage where the face should be. It turned its head, scanning. It was hunting my body heat. I scanned the room for options. My carbine would make noise, drawing more of them. I needed to blind it. My hand brushed against the scavenged items in my dump pouch. The road flares. I ripped the cap off a flare and struck it. The chemical hiss was deafening in the silence, and the room was instantly bathed in blinding, magnesium-white fire. The creature shrieked, a sound of tearing metal, and recoiled, thrashing its limbs as the intense heat source overloaded its sensory organs. It scrambled backward, smashing into a rack of test tubes. I didn't hesitate. I vaulted the table, sprinting for the heavy containment door at the far end of the lab. As I ran, I saw the creature lunging at the flare, attacking the heat source with feral madness, its bone spurs shattering the floor tiles. I slammed the door shut and spun the locking wheel, the heavy tumblers thudding into place just as a massive impact shattered the metal. I was in a corridor labeled cold storage. Rows of floor-to-ceiling glass tanks lined the walls. Inside them were the experiments. Hundreds of them. Not dead. Suspended. They were floating in liquid nitrogen, their bodies covered in that white, crystalline web. The terrifying realization hit me as I walked down the aisle. The facility wasn't built to cure them. It was built to weaponize them for Arctic warfare. And I had just rung the dinner bell. I moved faster, scavenging with frantic desperation now. I found a medical bay at the end of the hall. I raided the cabinets, sweeping everything into my bag: broad-spectrum antibiotics, surgical tubing, a portable defibrillator, and a canister of liquid nitrogen sealant. I needed a weapon that worked against things that loved the cold. I spotted a fire suppression station. Instead of water, these systems used halon gas to starve fires of oxygen. But next to it was a maintenance torch, an industrial-grade plasma cutter used for emergency bulkhead repairs. I grabbed it. It was heavy, the fuel cell reading 40%. It would have to do. To get out, I had to loop back to the ventilation control room on the upper gantry. I couldn't go back through the lab. I checked the schematics on a wall-mounted pad. There was a maintenance shaft running parallel to the cryotanks. I pried the hatch open with my knife and shimmied inside. The crawl space was tight, claustrophobic, and freezing. I could hear them scuttling below me now, a hive mind awakened by the disturbance. The metal beneath me vibrated. They were climbing the pipes. The evolution of the infection was terrifyingly efficient. They didn't groan or moan like the mindless hordes. They communicated with high-frequency chirps, coordinating their movements. They were pack hunters. I reached the gantry grate and kicked it out, dropping onto the metal walkway. Below me, the main hangar bay was swarming. Dozens of the pale, eyeless horrors were scaling the walls, their hooked limbs finding purchase in the concrete. I sprinted for the control room. A straggler, smaller than the others, leaped from the railing, intercepting me. It pinned me to the ground, its icy claws shredding the shoulder of my parka. The cold radiating from it was intense enough to burn. I could feel my skin blistering under the freezing touch. It opened its jaw, a vertical split in the chin lined with translucent, needle teeth. I jammed the nozzle of the plasma cutter into its chest and pulled the trigger. A beam of focused, superheated plasma erupted. The creature didn't just die, it detonated. The sudden thermal shock caused the crystalline structure of its body to shatter explosively. Shards of frozen gore peppered my visor. I shoved the steaming carcass off me and scrambled into the control room, welding the door shut with the cutter. I was safe, for the moment. But I was trapped. I looked out the reinforced window. The swarm was gathering at the door, scratching, testing the heat of the weld. I turned to the facility's main console. If I was going to die here, I wasn't going to let these things loose on the world. I began the sequence to vent the atmosphere, but then I saw the logs. Project Borealis wasn't just local. There were shipments. Drone deployments. The coordinates weren't just for this facility. They were seeding these things in every mountain range from the Alps to the Rockies. The infection hadn't just evolved, it had been strategically placed. I grabbed a portable hard drive and started the download. The world needed to know that the winter wasn't going to save us. The winter was the enemy. The hydraulic hiss of the airlock was the loudest sound I'd heard in 3 weeks, a mechanical scream that shattered the silence of the Himalayas. Inside, the air tasted recycled, stale, metallic, and deceptively sterile. I checked the Geiger counter on my wrist. The needle barely twitched. Radiation wasn't the threat here. It was whatever had necessitated a Bio-Containment Center at 15,000 feet, buried in the granite spine of the world. My breath plumed before me in the emergency lighting, the red strobes turning the condensation into bursts of bloody mist. I tightened the straps of my rucksack, the nylon creaking in the frozen quiet, and raised my carbine. The intake room was a graveyard of bureaucracy. Overturned desks, shattered monitors, and bodies. They weren't rotted. The altitude and the dry, sub-zero air inside the facility had mummified them. Their skin was pulled taut over cheekbones, gray and leathery, preserved in their final moments of panic. I moved to the nearest corpse, a security officer slumped against a reinforced glass partition. His uniform was crisp, the Dharma Initiative-style logo on the shoulder patch covered in frost. I didn't care about his allegiance. I cared about his belt. I knelt, my knees cracking, and stripped the mag pouches. 3 magazines of 9mm, fully loaded. I checked the slide of his sidearm. It was frozen shut. Useless. I left the gun but took the ammo. In his pocket, I found a protein bar, rock hard but sealed. I pocketed it. This was the reality of the New World, scavenging crumbs from the pockets of the dead while standing in a billion-dollar tomb. Moving deeper, the facility's layout shifted from administrative to clinical. The corridors narrowed, lined with brushed steel and thick plexiglass observation windows. I wiped a gloved hand across a foggy pane. Inside, the room was lined with cages. Not for monkeys or rats, but for larger things. The cages were torn open from the inside out. The bars were bent, the metal fatigued not by tools, but by brute, hysterical force. On the floor lay a clipboard. I shone my tactical light on the pages. Subject 89 exhibits paradoxical reaction to hypothermia, the log read. Metabolic rate increases as ambient temperature drops. The pathogen is rewriting the host's thermoregulation. It's not dying in the cold, it's weaponizing it. I swallowed hard, the dryness of my throat scratching like sandpaper. Down in the valleys, the infected were sluggish in winter, freezing solid until the thaw. Here, the virus had been forced to evolve or die. It chose evolution. I reached the central lab, a cavernous space dominated by a suspended walkway over a series of cryotanks. Most were smashed, the blue coolant fluid long since evaporated into a sticky residue on the floor. But the smell hit me then, not the sickly sweet scent of rot, but something sharp, chemical, like ozone and ammonia. I began to scavenge the workstations. I found a treasure trove, a box of broad-spectrum antibiotics, unopened, a sealed pack of sterile sutures, and miraculously, a ruggedized tablet with a sliver of battery life. I plugged it into my portable solar charger, hoping to pull a map, but the screen flickered with a surveillance playback. I watched the grainy footage. Scientists in clean suits were running. Behind them, a figure moved. It didn't shamble. It sprinted on all fours, its movements jerky and arachnid. It leaped, pinning a guard to the wall. Thermal imaging on the playback showed the creature wasn't warm. It was cold. Dark blue on the spectrum. It was absorbing heat from the environment, a heat sink predator. A clatter from the darkness below the walkway snapped me back to the present. I killed my flashlight instantly, plunging the lab into the rhythmic red pulsing of the emergency strobes. I crouched behind a centrifuge, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound came again. Wet footsteps. Slap. 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 I peered over the console. Below, amidst the wreckage of the cryotanks, something was moving. It looked like a man, stripped to the waist, but the anatomy was wrong. The skin was translucent, pale as ice, revealing a network of black veins pulsing beneath. It had no eyes, just scar tissue where sockets should have been, evolved for a pitch-black environment. Patches of its skin were covered in a crystalline growth, like frost accumulating on a windowpane, acting as natural armor. It stopped near a vent, tilting its head. It was hunting. And if the logs were right, it was hunting heat. I realized with horror that I was a beacon. My body heat, trapped inside my thermal layers, was radiating out. I was a bonfire in a blizzard to this thing. I needed a distraction. I unclipped a chemical hand warmer from my vest, cracked it to activate the reaction, and hurled it across the room toward the far wall. The packet hit a metal cabinet with a soft thud. The creature screamed, a sound like grinding metal, and launched itself at the noise. The speed was terrifying. It covered 30 feet in a second, tearing into the cabinet, slashing at the heat source. I moved. I stayed low, sprinting for the heavy blast doors on the far side of the lab. My boots squeaked on the linoleum. The creature whipped around. It ignored the chemical warmer now. The heat of my exertion was brighter. I raised my rifle and fired. The 5.56mm round hit the creature in the shoulder. It didn't bleed red, it bled a thick, blue sludge that steamed when it hit the air. The impact barely slowed it. The crystalline frost armor on its chest deflected the second shot. It shrieked and scrambled up the support pillar, moving along the ceiling like a gecko. I reached the blast door. Locked. Electronic keypad. Damn it! I shouted, abandoning stealth. I kicked the manual override lever, jamming my pry bar into the mechanism. The gears ground together, rusted and frozen. The creature dropped from the ceiling, landing 10 feet from me. Up close, the evolution was grotesque. Its mouth was a circular maw of needle teeth, designed to latch on and drain warmth. The air around it felt instantly colder, a radius of entropy that sapped the strength from my limbs. My fingers felt numb on the trigger. I fired a controlled burst at its legs. Bones shattered, and the creature collapsed, thrashing. It wasn't dead, just mobilized. The virus in its veins was trying to knit the tissue back together before my eyes, the blue sludge hardening into a temporary cast. I threw my weight against the pry bar. The door groaned and slid open a foot. Enough. I squeezed through, scraping my ribs, and slammed the lever down on the other side. The door slammed shut just as a heavy weight impacted it. The metal buckled outward, the shape of a fist embossing itself in the steel. I didn't wait. I ran down the corridor, the adrenaline warring with the hypoxia of the altitude. I found the pharmacy storage on the way out, Sector 4. I barely slowed down, sweeping shelves of labeled jars into my open pack. Epinephrine. Morphine. Dexamethasone. Gold. Pure gold. I hit the exit airlock, cycling the sequence with trembling fingers. The internal sensors were screaming now. Multiple biosigns detected. They were waking up. The gunshot had rung the dinner bell for every dormant horror in the facility. The outer door hissed open, and the Himalayan wind hit me like a physical blow, screaming at 70 miles per hour. I stumbled out into the blinding white, the snow instantly freezing the sweat on my face. Behind me, the facility lights turned from red to green, a containment breach protocol initiated. I scrambled down the rock face, the prize of medicine rattling in my bag. I had scavenged enough to keep me alive for months, but I had found something else, too. Knowledge. The infection wasn't just surviving the winter, it was waiting for it. The mountains weren't a sanctuary. They were a cocoon. And when spring came, whatever hatched from that facility wouldn't be stopped by a bullet to the brain. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door sounded like a dying breath, a long, agonizing exhalation of pressurized air that had been trapped inside the mountain for a decade. My Geiger counter clicked rhythmically, a metronome counting down the seconds of my life, but the levels were acceptable. It was the cold that worried me. Outside, the Himalayan wind screamed at 60 miles an hour, stripping the warmth from my thermal suit, but inside the airlock, the stillness was heavier. The silence had weight. It pressed against my eardrums, smelling of ozone, stagnant copper, and the distinct, cloying sweetness of rot that had been freeze-dried and preserved. I cycled the inner seal, gripping the cold steel of my pry bar. The lights were dead, save for the occasional pulse of an emergency strobe deeper in the corridor, casting long, sliding shadows that looked too much like fingers grasping for purchase on the frosted walls. This was the Apex Zenith Bio-Containment Center, a rumor whispered among the dying fires of the valley settlements. A place where the old world governments had tried to weaponize, or cure, the end of the world. I needed antibiotics. I needed filters for my rebreather. But mostly, I needed to know why the dead in the valleys were changing, and if the answer was buried here in the ice. I swept my flashlight beam across the reception area. The desk was overturned, shatterproof glass spiderwebbed with impact fractures. Behind it, a corpse sat slumped against the wall, but it wasn't skeletal. The extreme cold of the facility, likely maintained by a failing but persistent geothermal backup generator, had mummified the body. The skin was gray and pulled taut over bone, turning the face into a leathery mask of terror. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on broken vials and frost. Scavenging rule number 1, check the dead, but don't trust them. I prodded the body with the pry bar. Rigid. frozen solid. I knelt, patting down the lab coat. A keycard, level 4 access, and a crumpled pack of synthetic tobacco. Gold. I pocketed both, then checked the tactical vest the corpse was wearing beneath the coat. A loaded magazine for AP-90. I didn't have the gun, but the rounds were 5.7 by 28 millimeters, high velocity, armor-piercing. Valuable currency in the trade hubs. Pushing deeper into the facility, the architecture shifted from administrative sterile white to the oppressive industrial gray of containment sectors. The temperature dropped further. My breath plumed before me in thick, blinding clouds. I found a locker room labeled decontamination. This was the scavenge site I'd hoped for. I forced the first locker with a screech of tearing metal that echoed like a gunshot in a canyon. Empty. The second contained personal effects, photos of a family that was likely dead, a change of clothes that would disintegrate if I touched them. The third yielded a prize, a sealed emergency medical kit. I cracked the plastic seal, my fingers stiff inside my gloves. Inside were 3 ampoules of broad-spectrum antibiotics, a trauma bandage, and miraculously, a pristine epinephrine auto-injector. I stashed them in my rig, the adrenaline of the find warming me momentarily. But it was the 4th locker that stopped me cold. It wasn't closed. It had been torn open from the inside. The metal was bent outward, the steel peeled back like the skin of an orange. There were claw marks gouged into the neighboring locker, deep, parallel grooves that shredded the steel. Human fingernails didn't do that. Even the Shamblas down in the radiant zones didn't have that kind of tensile strength. I raised my weapon, a jury-rigged carbine, and moved toward the lab sector. The evolution of the infection was the primary theory for why the survivors were dying out. The early infected were slow, mindless. But nature abhors a vacuum, and the virus was learning. I reached Sector C, cryogenic pathology. The glass walls of the observation deck were intact, looking down into a sunken laboratory filled with rows of shattered tanks. Liquid nitrogen fog still clung to the floor in a knee-deep layer. I found a terminal that still had power, the amber cursor blinking hypnotically. I jacked in my portable drive, initiating a data dump, but while the progress bar crawled I read the logs. Subject 89, the entry read, dated 4 years after the fall. Adaptation to sub-zero environments is proceeding at a geometric rate. The pathogen has synthesized a glycol-based protein in the host's blood, effectively acting as biological antifreeze. The host does not freeze, it enters a state of suspended animation, indistinguishable from death, reducing metabolic rate to near zero. However, thermal stimuli trigger an immediate, violent awakening. The muscular structure has hypertrophied, hardening the dermis into a calcified shell to retain heat. My blood ran cold. I looked down into the lab. The bodies scattered across the floor. They weren't dead scientists. They were subjects. They were gray, bulky, their skin looking like cracked stone. And I was standing there, a radiating heat source in a box of ice. The download finished with a cheerful chirp. Too loud. Below me, in the swirling nitrogen fog, a head snapped up. It didn't groan. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a valve. The creature's eyes were milky white, devoid of pupils, but they locked onto my thermal signature instantly. It stood up, not with the clumsy stumble of a rotter, but with a fluid, predatory grace. Its skin was covered in jagged, bone-like protrusions, the calcified shell the logs mentioned. I yanked the drive and turned to run, but the glass wall of the observation deck shattered inward. The thing had leaped 12 feet vertically, crashing through the barrier with the force of a wrecking ball. I scrambled back, firing blindly. The bullet sparked off its chest, chipping the bone armor but failing to penetrate. It roared, a sound that wasn't vocal cords vibrating but something tearing in its throat. I scrambled over the reception desk, sliding across the polished floor as the creature slammed its fist into the laminate, punching a hole straight through the counter. This wasn't a zombie. This was a biological tank. I needed to create distance. I sprinted for the airlock, my boots skidding on the frost. Behind me, I heard the rhythmic thudding of its pursuit, heavy, fast, closing the gap. I fumbled for a flare in my belt pouch. The logs said they reacted to thermal stimuli. They were heat seekers. I ripped the cap off the flare and threw it down the hallway to my left, into an open office door. The magnesium ignited with a blinding red brilliance, sizzling on the wet floor. The creature skidded, its momentum carrying it past the door, but it twisted mid-stride, screeching at the sudden, intense heat source. It dove for the flare, attacking the fire with primal fury, clawing at the burning light. I didn't wait to watch. I hit the airlock controls. The outer door began to cycle, agonizingly slow. I could hear the creature realizing its mistake. The flare was dying. It shrieked again, a sound of pure frustration, and I heard the heavy slap of its feet on the metal grating, coming back for me. The crack of the outer door appeared, a sliver of blinding white Himalayan daylight. I squeezed through before it was fully open, tumbling out into the screaming wind and the snow. I scrambled away from the door, aiming my carbine at the widening gap. The creature appeared in the doorway, screeching at the wall of wind. But it didn't step out. The wind chill was 40 below zero. Even with its antifreeze blood, the sudden thermal shock of the storm was a barrier it wouldn't cross yet. It stood there, a silhouette of armored bone and rage, watching me disappear into the whiteout. I had the data. I had the meds. But as I descended the mountain, looking at the valley below where the spring thaw was just beginning, I realized the horror of what I had found. When the snow melts, they won't be trapped anymore.